Hey guys, tonight I want to take you on a journey back in time. Back to an era where childhood looked nothing like what we know today. Imagine a world where playtime meant standing still in lace collars, where medicine for teething babies included a spoonful of morphine, and where being hung outside your window in a wire cage was considered fresh air. Welcome to Victorian parenting. The kind of parenting that, if tried today, would probably have child protective services knocking on the door before breakfast. The Victorians had this strange mix of tenderness and terror when it came to raising kids. On the one hand, they believed deeply in discipline, structure, and moral character. On the other hand, their methods often looked like something out of a dark comedy. And that's what makes their world so fascinating. It was equal parts absurd, terrifying, and unintentionally hilarious. So tonight, dim your lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a blanket, but not 3 layers like Victorian kids were forced to wear, and let's step inside their world. What was it like to grow up in a time where toys could give you tetanus, breakfast looked like punishment, and silence wasn't just golden, it was law? Picture this. You're a child in London around 1885. The wallpaper in your nursery might literally be poisonous. Your nanny could strike fear into your soul with just a raised eyebrow. And your mother, well, she might love you dearly, but she's also not above rubbing brandy on your gums if you cry too much. Childhood was supposed to build character, and in the Victorian mind, character meant surviving discomfort with a polite smile. Let's start in the nursery, the heart of every Victorian childhood. These rooms were stuffed with rules and ruffles, but surprisingly short on fun. Imagine peeling pink wallpaper, doll houses with porcelain faces that look like they know your secrets, and a faint smell of boiled milk mixed with disinfectant strong enough to kill joy itself. Even the toys were more for show than for play. You might get one wooden soldier missing an arm, or a doll so unsettling you swore it blinked at night. And if you thought you could play with them freely, think again. Most toys were locked away in cabinets, for your own good, which really meant no joy without supervision. Discipline started early. Children were expected to tiptoe instead of walk, to keep their dolls clothed at all times. Heaven forbid a porcelain figure scandalize Aunt Prudence. And to play with the reverence you'd normally reserve for holy relics. Laughing too loudly, inventing a silly game, or heaven help you, running, was treated as moral failure. And always in the corner stood Nanny's chair. Not for naps, but for observation, interrogation, and the occasional sermon on the dangers of idle hands. The meals weren't much kinder. Breakfast wasn't about bonding or joy, it was about endurance. Imagine staring down a bowl of gray, lumpy porridge that looked and tasted like despair itself. Sugar, a luxury saved for Christmas. Butter, only for honored guests. If you were lucky, maybe you found a rogue raisin hiding in the sludge, or maybe it was just a dead fly. Either way, you ate it. Because breakfast, according to Victorian parents, built moral fortitude. And then there were the rules about silence. You've heard the old phrase, children should be seen and not heard. In Victorian England, that wasn't just a saying, it was the survival code. You learned to blend into the wallpaper, to walk across squeaky floorboards without making a sound, and to answer questions with short, respectful sentences. Yes, father. No, mother. Sorry, grandmama, I'll never mention frogs again. One wrong giggle at the dinner table could send you straight to bed without supper, or worse, into the dreaded reflection chair to contemplate your sins under the gaze of a weeping angel print. But silence wasn't the only form of discipline. Victorian parents believed deeply in the power of shame. A sigh from your mother could cut deeper than any spanking. A raised eyebrow from your father could make you rethink your entire life. And for more stubborn kids, out came the wooden spoon, the slipper, or the all-purpose hairbrush. Each had its own role tailored to the crime, whether it was spilling milk, talking back, or scandal of scandals, laughing during prayers. And yet, for every rule, every punishment, there were odd little rewards. Maybe a single toffee handed out with the reverence of a holy sacrament. Maybe a rare word of praise from Father that echoed in your heart until at least tea time. Childhood was less about joy and more about dodging landmines of shame, porridge, and poisonous wallpaper. Still, somehow, kids survived. They learned to read the moods of adults like skilled diplomats, to negotiate lesser punishments with clever trades, and to find joy in the smallest things: a crust of bread, a rare glimpse of the street through a nursery window, or the thrill of sneaking a laugh without being caught. So, let's say you've made it through breakfast without crying into your porridge, and you've tiptoed past Aunt Prudence without tripping over the footstool. Congratulations, you're still alive. But in Victorian childhood, survival wasn't just about rules and silence. The real danger often lurked in the family medicine cabinet. Now, when you picture medicine today, you probably think of bright white bottles, little measuring cups, maybe a sticker from the pediatrician if you were really brave. But in the 1800s, the medicine chest looked more like something out of a witch's kitchen, or a chemist who gave up halfway through medical school. Got a cough? Out comes a syrup that smells like bad whiskey, looks like swamp water, and proudly advertises a magical blend of alcohol, opium, and chloroform. 2 spoonfuls later, you're either sleeping like an angel, hallucinating about angels, or composing poetry to the wallpaper. Side effects, not listed, or if they were ignored, because in Victorian logic, if it knocked you out, it worked. Cut your finger on a toy soldier. Forget antiseptic cream. You'd get mercury ointment dabbed on by a nanny who swore the sting was proof it was working. Bigger wound, carbolic acid, think about that acid, followed by healing paste, which was basically lard mixed with optimism. If you complained about the pain, you got a lecture about how suffering built character. Bruises were another favorite, the cure. Rub it with goose fat or butter. Apparently the solution to pain was to make yourself more edible. Stomach ache, that was castor oil's moment to shine. A punishment so feared that kids faked perfect health just to avoid it. Constipation, oil, diarrhea. A bowl of gray rice gruel and a warning about unruly intestines. Either way, you were miserable. And let's not forget the holy grail of Victorian parenting, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, advertised as the miracle cure for fussiness, teething, colic, basically any sound that came out of a baby. The secret ingredients, morphine and alcohol. Yep, they were dosing infants with narcotics and calling it love. Parents raved about it. He slept through the night, and so did we, they said proudly, while quietly ignoring the fact that the baby now stared at the ceiling with a permanent smile for 3 days straight. If the syrup wasn't around, you had powders, drafts, or cooling tonics, all promising to calm the humors but really just knocking you flat with a rash on the side. And when those failed, there was always the family doctor, who arrived with a black bag full of leeches. Because in Victorian logic, if you weren't bleeding, you weren't healing. Even nerves weren't safe. Imagine being a child who was a little anxious, maybe jumped at thunder. The treatment: Another spoonful of syrup to shut you up, or worse, something called cooling powders that were basically a nap disguised as medicine. Anxiety wasn't real, said the Victorians. You were either good, bad, or in need of a plaster that smelled like mustard and regret. Illness in this world wasn't a private moment, it was a family drama. Everybody weighed in. Grandma swore by garlic necklaces. Your uncle recommended turpentine drops. The doctor muttered about miasmas and opened another jar of leeches. And you just wanted some rest, maybe a hug and a cure that didn't make you glow in the dark. But here's the crazy part. Kids survived. Somehow. They made it through a minefield of potions, ointments, and syrups that could knock out a horse. They grew up tough, not because the medicine worked, but because they learned how to fake being healthy just to avoid another spoonful. So if you've ever struggled to take a chalky antibiotic, remember this. At least nobody's rubbing goose fat on your bruises or handing you mercury ointment for a scrape. In the Victorian world, medicine was less about healing and more about surviving the cure itself. If Victorian medicine didn't break you, your siblings just might. Forget the sweet, Instagram-perfect images of brothers and sisters holding hands in matching outfits. In a Victorian nursery, sibling life was a Cold War mixed with a circus. Alliances were shaky, betrayals were daily, and truce usually lasted only until the next slice of stale bread showed up. You see, nothing was safe in that room. Turn your back for a second and your favorite toy, a chipped marble, a spinning top, or maybe a tin soldier missing an arm, was suddenly gone, parading proudly in someone else's pocket. That stash of peppermints you hid so carefully vanished, replaced by sticky fingerprints and a smug grin from your little brother. The nursery was less about play and more about strategy. Every sibling learned to negotiate like a politician and fight like a lawyer. Older ones pulled rank, younger ones tattled for immunity, and the middle child perfected the art of disappearing. And all of it happened under the shadow of Nanny's footsteps. Because here's the rule. When Nanny entered the room, the war froze. Instant ceasefire. Everyone straightened up, angelic smiles plastered across their faces, embroidery in hand, Latin recitations suddenly fascinating. But the second she left, chaos. Pillows turned into weapons. Wooden blocks became missiles. Even the family dog got drafted as either a shield or an accomplice. And oh, the betrayals. If you ever dared whisper your secret hiding place for sweets to a trusted sibling, don't expect it to survive until morning. Instead, you'd wake up to find your peppermint stash ransacked and a mocking note that read, "Better luck next time." Curtain forts collapsed when your allies defected mid-battle. Treaties signed in crayon lasted about as long as a jam tart in a room full of 6-year-olds. But here's the twist. The moment an adult appeared with cod liver oil in one hand and a wooden spoon in the other, all those rivalries vanished. Suddenly, you were a united army, standing shoulder to shoulder, wide-eyed and innocent, swearing you had no idea who spilled the ink, broke the chair, or released the hedgehog into the pantry. And in those rare moments of unity, you discovered something strange. As much as you fought, you needed each other. When one of you was marched off for extra handwriting drills, the others smuggled scraps of cheese through the cracks in the door. When one of you got caught in the dreaded reflection chair, the others pulled faces from across the hall to make you laugh. Nights were the best. After the chaos of the day, you'd crawl under scratchy blankets, whispering stories and jokes until your sides ached from stifled laughter. Plans were made for future heists, stealing a cake from the kitchen, sneaking into the garden, or daring each other to peek into the attic. By morning, of course, someone would ruin it by snitching, but for those quiet minutes, it felt like you were in it together. Sibling life in Victorian England was survival training. You learned to negotiate, to bribe, to scheme, and to forgive just enough to keep the game going. And even if your childhood was haunted by betrayal and jam theft, you'd secretly admit years later that you'd never trade it. Because the truth was, nothing bonded you more than surviving the Victorian nursery, with its cold porridge, haunted dolls, and nannies all seeing eyes together. But if you think the sibling wars were brutal, wait until you hear about discipline. Because in Victorian England, the wooden spoon wasn't just a kitchen tool. It was practically a family heirloom. If you grew up in a Victorian household, you didn't need a police officer or a schoolmaster to keep you in line. You already had the most feared weapons of the age: the wooden spoon, the hairbrush, and a mother whose sigh could crush your soul harder than any punishment. Discipline wasn't just about correction. It was about character building. Or at least that's what every adult told you while waving around an object that clearly had other purposes in life. The family motto might as well have been stitched into every cushion: spare the rod, spoil the child. And boy, did they take that seriously. Every offense had its tool. Spill your milk. That earned you the corner, standing stiff as a soldier while reciting the Lord's Prayer backward. Speak out of turn at dinner. Out came the punishment chair, an ornate wooden seat placed directly under the stern gaze of your ancestors' portraits, as if their ghostly eyes were silently judging your poor manners. Run indoors. That was a brisk march outside in the rain, timed with a pocket watch, because apparently pneumonia was an acceptable form of discipline. And yet, the real weapon wasn't always physical. Shame was sharper than any cane. Your mother's raised eyebrow could make you reconsider your entire life. A single disappointed sigh from your father was enough to send you spiraling into a week of moral repentance. Even the family dog seemed to judge you with a pitying glance when you got scolded. Dinner became a tribunal of your misdeeds. One muddy footprint in the parlor, and suddenly the whole family was convened for a dramatic retelling of your crime. You'd sit, red-faced, while Aunt Prudence delivered a lecture on how this small slip might lead to your eventual downfall, and somehow, the decline of the empire. And then came the public confessions. If you dared giggle during prayers or forgot to curtsy to the umbrella stand, you might be summoned to stand in front of the entire household and explain yourself. Siblings smirked, grandparents sighed, and you swore never again until the next time. Rewards were just as strange. A sweet, a shiny penny, or most precious of all, a simple, well done from your father. Those words echoed louder than a church bell, carrying you through an entire week of silence and starch. But here's the thing, children are adaptable. You became a master at reading the room, calculating just how much mischief you could get away with before the spoon appeared. You learned the subtle art of negotiating lesser punishments, offering to scrub an extra pot in exchange for avoiding the lecture on the dangers of unchecked enthusiasm. In a way, it wasn't just about discipline. It was training. Training you to be quiet, careful, endlessly patient, and ready to survive whatever life or Aunt Prudence threw your way. And if you think discipline was harsh, wait until you hear about sweets. Because in Victorian England, a piece of candy wasn't just a treat. It was an event that could change the entire household mood for days. In a Victorian childhood, nothing had the power to electrify a room quite like the promise of sweets. Forget toys, forget extra playtime. Candy was the currency of joy, the rare jewel in a world of porridge, cabbage, and lectures about moral fiber. But sweets weren't everyday indulgences. They were rare, rationed, and treated with the solemnity of a religious sacrament. A jar of barley sugar on the high shelf wasn't just candy. It was a holy relic, doled out only on birthdays, Queen Victoria's Jubilee, or on the miraculous day your mother felt unusually generous after her second sherry. Hard candies, wrapped by hand and shining in impossible colors, were both enchanting and terrifying. You weren't allowed to bite them. No, you had to let them dissolve slowly, silently, as if savoring was proof of good character. To chomp down was an act of rebellion equal to heresy. Chocolate existed, but forget the creamy, silky kind you know today. Back then, it was gritty, waxy, and so bitter it felt more like penance than pleasure. Still, the mere fact that it was chocolate made it a treasure worth enduring. Turkish delight, powdered with enough sugar to trigger sneezes, was the gold standard of the upper middle class, sticky, decadent, and always guarded carefully by adults who thought children didn't deserve quite so much happiness. And yet, even the smallest treat carried weight. A single peppermint lozenge slipped into your palm could feel like winning the lottery. A sticky bun from the bakery, if shared among siblings, became the centerpiece of whispered negotiations and near-political alliances. But every sweet came with a shadow: dentistry. Toothaches were practically a rite of passage, and Victorian dentists were more butchers than healers. Armed with rusty pliers and a bottle of gin, they'd yank the offending tooth with all the tenderness of a blacksmith. You learned early on that sometimes the ache of sugar was preferable to the terror of the cure, which meant sweets were consumed in secrecy as often as they were in celebration. Children became cunning smugglers. Candies hidden in hollowed-out books, tucked inside boots, or stashed under floorboards became legendary treasures. Older siblings guarded their stashes with the ruthlessness of pirates, and younger ones staged raids with the desperation of starving bandits. At the annual fair, though that was paradise, stalls overflowed with gingerbread men, sticky toffee apples, and boiled sweets in colors nature never intended. For one brief day, you stuffed yourself with enough sugar to forget the taste of gray porridge, knowing full well you'd pay the price later, clutching your stomach while your mother muttered about moderation. In the end, sweets were more than food. They were childhood distilled into a single bite, rare, fleeting, dangerously addictive, and always remembered long after the taste was gone. And just as you're coming down from the sugar high, reality snapped back with school. And school in Victorian England. Well, that was less education and more a daily test of endurance. If breakfast was a test of your stomach, then school was a test of your soul. Imagine walking into a drafty classroom where the air smells faintly of ink, chalk, and a dozen nervous children who know that one wrong answer could earn them a bruise, a humiliation, or worse. That was Victorian education, less about learning, more about survival. The room itself felt like a prison designed by someone who hated joy. Splintery wooden desks lined up in rigid rows, each fitted with a tiny ink pot that seemed specifically designed to leak onto your cuffs. The blackboard loomed like an executioner's wall, its surface dusty with the ghosts of lessons past. And the teacher's desk, a throne of judgment, stacked high with books and the ever-present cane, just waiting to swoop down on a careless hand. Lessons were drilled into you like military orders. Multiplication tables were to be recited forwards, backwards, sideways, and probably in your sleep. Latin was considered essential, because nothing prepares a child for life like conjugating verbs in a dead language. Geography meant memorizing distant colonies painted neatly in pink on the classroom map, with the unspoken message that the world belonged to Britain, even if you barely belonged to yourself. History, mostly kings, queens, battles, and a side note that the French couldn't be trusted. The teachers were characters themselves, equal parts warden, philosopher, and tormentor. Mr. Snipe, the mathematics teacher, had the uncanny ability to materialize behind you whenever your mind drifted. Miss Grimshaw, who taught handwriting, could spot a crooked letter from across the room like a hawk spotting prey. And heaven forbid you blot your page with too much ink. That was practically a crime against the crown. Discipline ruled the day. The dunce cap was more than punishment, it was public humiliation, a paper crown of shame that turned every child into a spectacle for the others. Then there was the cane swishing through the air with theatrical menace. A single misstep, a misspelling, a whisper, even a sigh, and you'd feel the sting. And yet the worst punishment wasn't physical. It was being forced to stand and recite moral verses, trembling before the entire class while your voice cracked under the weight of words about virtue you didn't understand. Lunch was no comfort. Cold bread, a wedge of cheese if you were lucky, or last night's stew if you weren't. No cafeteria, no chatter, just a drafty hall where you learned quickly that food was fuel, not joy. Then came recess, if you could call it that. Games were strictly regulated. Marching in circles around the yard counted as exercise. Anything too rowdy, like marbles, tag, or laughter, was swiftly shut down. And yet children found ways to resist. A hidden novel smuggled under a desk, a whispered joke passed across the aisle, a game of secret glances with a friend. These tiny rebellions became lifelines, proof that even in a system designed to crush individuality, sparks of childhood could still flicker. By the time the school bell rang, your hand ached from endless copy work. Your back was stiff from sitting like a soldier, and your spirit was a little more worn. But if you made it through the day without tears or welts, you counted it as a victory. School didn't just teach facts. It taught silence, obedience, and how to survive boredom so intense it could break a weaker soul. And maybe that was the point. Education wasn't meant to open minds. It was meant to mold them into neat little boxes, stamped with discipline and sealed with ink. And as you trudged home, clutching your books, you knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow, you'd do it all again. Because in Victorian England, school wasn't just mandatory. It was a way of breaking you down, one Latin verb at a time. If school tested your patience, the family medicine cabinet tested your luck. Step into any Victorian nursery or parlor, and you'd find a wooden chest stuffed with bottles, powders, and potions that would make a modern pharmacist faint or call the police. It wasn't so much healthcare as it was alchemy, where every cure came with a side effect, and survival was more miracle than science. Got a cough? Out came a thick brown syrup that smelled like a brewery on its worst day. 2 spoonfuls, your mother insisted, and you'd feel better. Better usually meant you'd be asleep for the next 12 hours, floating somewhere between fever dreams and visions of the wallpaper. That's because the syrup was laced with alcohol, opium, and a dash of chloroform for good measure. It didn't cure you, but you were too unconscious to care. For cuts and scrapes, they had mercury ointment. Yes, actual mercury. Dabbed on liberally until your skin tingled and your parents nodded proudly, convinced pain meant healing. For bruises, goose fat was rubbed on the skin, leaving you slippery and smelling like dinner. Burns were treated with a mix of carbolic acid and lard, a recipe that seemed invented by someone who had never seen a human body before. And then there was the infamous Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed as a miracle cure for fussy babies. It was essentially morphine in a bottle. Parents swore by it. One spoonful and the child slept all night, they boasted, ignoring the fact that their baby spent the next morning smiling eerily at the curtains. This syrup was so effective it silenced not just children, but probably minor spirits and small farm animals too. If you had a fever, the treatment could be worse than the illness. Mustard plasters slapped onto your chest until your skin burned red. Garlic necklaces tied around your neck to draw out the sickness. And if that didn't work, the doctor arrived with his black bag full of leeches, forceps, and the conviction that bleeding you dry was always the answer. Stomach problems. Oh, those had their own nightmares. Constipation was punished with castor oil, a punishment so legendary that children prayed never to fall victim. One spoonful could traumatize you for weeks. Diarrhea, on the other hand, earned you a bland meal of rice gruel and a stern lecture about unruly intestines, as if your stomach had committed a moral crime. Even nerves, yes, a child's jitters or fears were treated like an illness. Too energetic, you got a powder to cool your humors, which mostly meant you napped for half the day. Too anxious, another syrup. Too happy, probably another lecture followed by, you guessed it, more syrup. The medicine chest was both a wonder and a curse. Powders that fizzed, lozenges that glued your tongue to your teeth, tonics that promised glowing vitality but mostly left you queasy. To survive, you quickly learned to fake being healthy. Anything to avoid another spoonful of mystery liquid that tasted like despair and shoe polish. And yet, illness was always a family affair. The whole household gathered around, offering advice, arguing over cures, and reminiscing about that time Cousin Algernon was cured with 3 drops of turpentine and a stern talking to. The real cure was time and luck. If you pulled through, it was declared proof of the family's remedies. If not, well, clearly you hadn't prayed hard enough. In the end, the Victorian medicine cabinet didn't just treat symptoms, it built resilience. You grew up suspicious of anything labeled soothing and deeply appreciative of plain water. And if you lived long enough to tell the tale, you carried the scars, rashes, and iron stomach that came from surviving the strangest pharmacy in history. If the medicine cabinet didn't finish you off, your siblings just might. Forget rosy images of Victorian children holding hands by the fire. Real life inside the nursery was closer to a battlefield, part chess match, part street brawl, and part courtroom drama where the verdict was always unfair. Every alliance was temporary. One day your older sister promised to share her stash of peppermints. The next, she raided your hiding spot and left a mocking note in its place. Brothers swore loyalty in the Great Curtain Fort War, only to defect the moment the nanny's footsteps echoed down the hall. Treaties were scribbled in crayon, sealed with sticky hands, and broken before nightfall. Possessions were never truly yours. Leave your favorite marble unattended for a minute and it rolled into enemy territory. That toy soldier you adored, suddenly conscripted into your brother's army, fighting against you. Even clothes weren't safe. One morning you discover your nightshirt mysteriously vanished, only to find your sister wearing it as a victory robe. And yet, the moment adults appeared, the entire battlefield went silent. Hostilities paused, and everyone became model children. The same siblings who had been chasing you with a broken abacus instantly sat cross-legged, humming hymns, as if butter wouldn't melt in their mouths. Parents never suspected a thing. Escape plots were a favorite pastime. Together, you might spend hours scheming to sneak into the pantry for forbidden jam, or to dig for buried treasure in the garden, usually last year's forgotten carrots. Every plan depended on stealth, teamwork, and luck. And every plan was ruined by one sibling, the youngest, who couldn't whisper to save their life. Still, nothing united siblings faster than an external threat. The dreaded bottle of cod liver oil, the announcement of bath night, or worse, the booming call of "Father wants to see you." In that instant, rivalries melted, and suddenly you were a tight-knit band of comrades, wide-eyed and silent, pretending innocence like your lives depended on it. Bedtime brought a fragile truce. Under scratchy wool blankets, you whispered jokes, recounted the day's battles, and plotted future rebellions. For a few minutes, the nursery became less of a war zone and more of a secret club where the only membership fee was survival. Growing up with Victorian siblings didn't just teach you how to share. It taught you strategy, diplomacy, and betrayal. You learned to read faces, to barter with buttons and crumbs of cake, to keep secrets, and when to sacrifice them for leverage. It was brutal, hilarious, and unforgettable. And as you drifted off to sleep, the sound of quiet snoring and muffled giggles reminded you of one unshakable truth. Family was both your greatest enemy and your fiercest ally. In the chaos of Victorian childhood, you were all in it together, whether you liked it or not. If there's one thing you could never escape in a Victorian household, it was advice. Advice poured down on you like the London rain, constant, unasked for, and almost never useful. Parents and grandparents treated warnings the way we treat small talk, mandatory, relentless, and usually based on half-remembered folklore rather than fact. Stand too close to a drafty window. You get a 10-minute lecture about cousin Percival, who once caught a chill and supposedly lost his sense of direction forever. Come inside with damp hair. Your mother would sigh dramatically and tell the story of a girl from Ipswich who did just that and was never the same again. What happened to her? No one knew. But the message was clear: dry your hair or risk permanent doom. Every sniffle was a sign from the universe. A cough, mustard plasters, a sneeze. Wrap yourself in flannel, rub your chest with goose fat, and take 2 teaspoons of something that tasted like despair. Fathers often offered their own medical wisdom, which sounded suspiciously like pep talks. The cure for a sore throat, he'd insist, is a brisk walk and a good attitude. As if morale alone could defeat strep throat. Reading wasn't safe either. If you read by candlelight, you'd go blind. If you read novels, your mind would wander until you became unsuitable for marriage. Too much reading of any kind could make you faint, develop nervous tendencies, or, in extreme cases, overheat the brain. The only approved books were religious tracts, moral poetry, and the occasional Latin grammar. Fun, right? And then there were the odd little one-liners that stuck in your head long after you stopped believing them. Don't cross your eyes or they'll stay that way forever. Don't rock an empty cradle or tragedy will follow. Always carry a handkerchief, a shilling, and an alibi. Never trust a man with 2 first names. Practical advice, the kind you actually needed, was never included. Nobody told you how to avoid nanny's radar, how to sneak food without getting caught, or what to do if you spilled ink on your Sunday best. Instead, you became an expert at nodding politely while privately plotting your next act of rebellion. Yet, As maddening as it was, all that advice came from the same anxious place. Love mixed with superstition, fear, and the desperate hope that you'd make it to adulthood without catastrophe. It was confusing, sometimes laughable, occasionally terrifying. But it became the background noise of your childhood, a constant reminder that in Victorian England, safety, virtue, and a little paranoia were always in fashion. Imagine waking up every morning in what looked like a cozy nursery, but was really a slow-motion chemistry experiment. That was Victorian childhood. The walls were painted in delicate pastels, soft pinks, gentle blues, and the ever-popular Victorian green. It looked cheerful. It looked elegant. It also contained enough arsenic to take down a small horse. Lead paint coated your alphabet blocks, your rocking horse, even the cheerful furniture in your dollhouse. If boredom drove you to gnaw on a toy, which every child eventually did, you got a metallic aftertaste that wasn't your imagination. It was lead. The curtains were no better. Dyed in colors with names like Paris green, they shimmered beautifully in the light while slowly releasing toxins into the air. And if you ever touched them too much, you'd end up with a rash that nobody could quite explain. The floors weren't safe either. That lush patterned carpet hiding the crumbs from last week's pudding. It was treated with mercury-based dyes for brightness. You couldn't see the danger, but your pounding headaches probably did. Even the humble teething ring, a small comfort for a cranky baby, was often carved from ivory or bone, dipped in leftover paint from the hallway. In other words, your first lesson in life came laced with poison. And then there was asbestos, the miracle material of the Victorian age. They stuffed it in cracks, wove it into curtains, and sprinkled it around the fireplace to keep the home safe. Which is a polite way of saying you were breathing in slow-burning danger every time you cuddled up near the hearth. Adults praised it as modern science, while you coughed and wondered why your throat always felt scratchy. Bedtime was its own chemical trial. Your mattress was stuffed with horsehair feathers, and whatever fabric scraps hadn't already been recycled into curtains. By the time you were tucked in under blankets that smelled faintly of camphor and lavender, you were marinating in fumes no doctor would recommend today. Ventilation, forget it. The windows either jammed shut or let in icy drafts, so parents compromised by stuffing the gaps with, you guessed it, asbestos padding. Survive long enough, and you developed a weird kind of immunity. Family legend might even include an uncle who licked the wallpaper once and lived to tell the tale, though he was never quite the same afterward. The cat, wise enough to avoid the nursery altogether, spent its days in the hallway, glaring as if to say, "I told you so." Looking back, it feels miraculous that any Victorian child lived to adulthood. But somehow they did, through sheer stubbornness and resilience. Maybe that's the real legacy of growing up in a poisonous house. You learned early that survival wasn't about comfort, but about grit. If there's one thing Victorians loved almost as much as rules, it was diet fads. Not the kind you scroll past on Instagram. These were stranger, stricter, and usually boiled. Food wasn't about joy. It was about virtue, discipline, and proving you could stomach just about anything without complaining. Breakfast might start with porridge so gray it could double as mortar, followed the next day by slippery elm gruel, recommended by some doctor whose only credentials were a massive set of sideburns. And just when you got used to that, someone read a letter in the Times praising the benefits of boiled prunes, and suddenly that's all you saw for 2 weeks. Beef tea was another favorite. A dish that sounded hearty but turned out to be nothing more than warm, watery beef broth. Children were told it built strength. In reality, it built resentment. Arrowroot was praised as the ultimate soothing food, though it tasted like wet chalk. Even bread wasn't safe. Patent flour loaves were advertised as easier to digest, though most people found them harder to swallow, literally. Victorian mothers took these diet crazes seriously, clutching testimonials the way we clutch Yelp reviews. If a doctor promised cabbage water could cure nerves, you'd better believe it was on the menu. Toast water, yes, you heard that right, was another so-called miracle. Bread charred, soaked in boiling water, strained and served lukewarm as if it were some divine elixir. And tea, sometimes purified with vinegar, because why not ruin a perfectly good drink in the name of health? Kids were caught in the crossfire of these culinary experiments. Too skinny. Here, eat pudding made from suet and lard for a week. Too chubby. Say hello to raw carrots and barley mash until you slim down. The underlying message was always the same. If food tastes good, you're doing something wrong. Desserts were rationed like gold. A scrap of jam or a sugared bun could spark jealousy worthy of a Dickens plot. And sweets, when they appeared, carried guilt baked in. Don't eat too fast or you'll corrupt your soul. Don't take more than one or you'll end up with bad morals. Imagine eating candy while being told it might doom your eternal soul. Not exactly fun. Still, children adapted. They learned to hide scraps in potted plants, sneak bits of cheese when no one was watching, or trade unwanted food with siblings under the table. These little rebellions gave them moments of joy in a world where every bite felt like a moral exam. In the end, Victorian diet fads didn't build stronger bodies so much as stronger survival skills. If you could endure cabbage water, beef tea, and the horror of soggy toast water, you could endure anything. Maybe that's why those children grew up so tough, because even lunch was an endurance test. Nowhere does the odd mix of joy and discipline show up more clearly than at Christmas. Today, we think of cozy lights, too much food, and kids tearing into piles of gifts. In Victorian England, picture something more like a survival challenge with pine needles. Preparation started weeks ahead. The drawing room was scrubbed until the wallpaper nearly peeled. Arguments broke out over whether holly or mistletoe was less dangerous to the family cat, and the smell of dried oranges and cloves filled the house. The Christmas tree itself, an import from Germany popularized by Queen Victoria, was decorated with fragile glass ornaments and incredibly candles. Real candles, stuck into branches of a very flammable tree. The only fire prevention system was a bucket of sand placed in the corner, guarded nervously by every adult in the house. On Christmas morning, children woke to modest gifts. Maybe a wooden toy, a knitted scarf, or the ultimate luxury, a single orange. Yes, an orange. In an age before global shipping and supermarkets, that citrus was a glowing orb of treasure. It was the Victorian equivalent of unwrapping the latest iPhone. Breakfast was light, just bread or maybe cheese because the big event was dinner. The table groaned under goose or, if fortune smiled, turkey, surrounded by potatoes, pies, and of course, the infamous Christmas pudding. This wasn't just dessert, it was a spectacle. Doused in brandy and set aflame, it lit up the room while children gasped and elderly relatives clapped like it was the highlight of the year. After the feast came speeches and toasts. Long, rambling ones about family honor, the Queen, and how much harder Christmas used to be. When I was young, All we got was a walnut and we were grateful. By evening, games were played, parlor amusements with rules so complicated that no one could win, dramatic readings from Dickens, and if you were unlucky, a freezing walk outside to aid digestion. Children were required to show gratitude for every gift, even socks, with solemn thank yous to every adult in the room. Laughter was allowed, but only in moderation. Too much merriment was considered unseemly. Still, despite the rules, the scolding, and the very real fire hazards, Christmas left Victorian children glowing with memories. They clutched their single toy or precious orange as if it were treasure beyond price. And maybe, in a way, it was. Christmas in Victorian England wasn't about abundance. It was about survival, ritual, and making sure the tree didn't actually burn down. And if you went to bed that night sticky with pudding and clutching your gift, you carried with you the one thing every Victorian parent insisted upon: a sense of gratitude, even if it had to be enforced with a lecture. If you were a Victorian child, chances are you had pets. But don't picture the modern kind of pampered, squeaky clean companions. These were pets with a purpose, or at least pets that tested your patience and occasionally your immune system. A wealthy family might own a small terrier, always yapping at the delivery men, or a canary that chirped endlessly in the window. Some children even had hedgehogs, acquired in a moment of naturalist enthusiasm, only for them to spend the rest of their days knocking over ink bottles and hiding under furniture. Pets weren't just for fun. They were moral teachers. Dogs were supposed to teach loyalty, birds patience, and hedgehogs humility, mostly because they hurt if you picked them up the wrong way. But alongside the official pets came the unofficial ones. The nursery was alive with uninvited creatures, spiders in corners, ants marching out whenever someone spilled jam, and the ever-present hum of flies. Bed bugs lived in the mattresses, mice held midnight meetings in the walls, and lice, well, lice lived in your hair, happily ignored until bath night. Nanny kept a comb for them, and an expression that suggested she had seen things no child should ever force her to see again. Efforts to fight pests were creative but rarely effective. Sticky paper traps dangled from the ceiling. Lavender sachets were stuffed under pillows to ward off moths. The family cat was expected to earn its keep by catching mice, but more often it lounged by the fire, utterly indifferent to everything except being admired. Sometimes the line between pet and pest blurred. A particularly bold mouse might be secretly adopted by siblings, fed scraps of cheese until it became a semi-official resident of the nursery. There were stories of tadpoles raised in water jugs, of canaries escaping and refusing to come down from the Christmas tree, and of hedgehogs discovered curled up in drawers of underclothes. Every mishap became a family legend, retold at dinner until it grew into myth. For Victorian children, caring for animals, wanted or not, taught lessons in resilience. You learned how to build tiny coffins for hamsters, how to hide flea bites with long sleeves, and how to tell the difference between sympathy and toughen up when your favorite pet met an untimely end. Sentimentality was reserved for ponies or the occasional goose spared at Christmas. For everything else, life was fleeting and dust returns to dust. And yet, despite the lice, the fleas, and the ever-present mice, the nursery never felt lonely. The sigh of a dog by the hearth, the trill of a bird in its cage, or even the quiet nibble of a mouse at a forgotten biscuit reminded you that the Victorian household was never empty. It was a zoo, A farm and an insect colony rolled into one, and you, whether you liked it or not, were part of the ecosystem. Play for a Victorian child was never just play. It was training. It was a lesson wrapped in lace, stitched together with rules and sprinkled with just enough danger to build character. If you were wealthy, your nursery might have toys that looked like museum pieces. Rocking horses with real horsehair manes, doll houses complete with tiny furniture, geography puzzles painted with the British Empire proudly glowing pink across the map. These toys weren't meant to unleash your imagination. They were meant to remind you of order, empire, and manners. Even a game of tea party had less to do with fun and more to do with practicing the exact angle at which you should pour Darjeeling for a guest. But even then, play was supervised. Nanny hovered by the doorway like a hawk in a starched apron, ready to swoop in at the first giggle that sounded too joyful or the first scuffle that looked suspiciously like fun. Outdoor games were refined. Croquet on the lawn, skipping rope while reciting French verbs, or an extremely delicate hopscotch game in the drawing room where God forbid you toppled a vase. Shouting, running, and above all, laughing too loudly were frowned upon. After all, as the favorite saying went, children with loose morals make too much noise. If you weren't born into lace collars and brass toy chests, your play looked very different. Working-class children invented joy out of scraps. A hoop rolled down the alley became a race. A stick turned into a sword, a wand, or a cricket bat depending on the day. Alleyways became battlefields, markets became obstacle courses, and sometimes a captured mouse stood in as a racing competitor. Your games didn't come in boxes. They came from imagination, grit, and the ability to ignore the mud clinging to your boots. And yet, no matter your class, games carried risk. Wooden blocks became projectiles in sibling wars. Marbles chipped teeth and bruised egos. Doll houses were beautiful but filled with hazards sharp enough to draw blood. Even the rocking horse seemed built for mishap, daring you to ride until the inevitable splinter reminded you that fun was never free. There was hierarchy too. Older kids made the rules, younger kids followed or revolted in whispers. Cheating was technically forbidden but secretly admired if you were clever enough not to get caught. The rare prizes, a sweet, a penny, or the right to sit closest to the fire, kept the games going, fueled by the thrill of victory and the dread of shame. And yet, despite the rules, the risks, and the constant adult disapproval, fun had a way of breaking through. Mud pies found their mark. Marble collections survived raids from both siblings and cats. And laughter, though quickly shushed, bubbled up anyway. Because for all the strictness of Victorian life, children still found ways to chase joy, whether with a hoop on the street, a haunted-eyed doll, or simply a stick and the stubborn refusal to be bored. In the end, play wasn't just play. It was survival, and if you could make it through childhood games without losing all your marbles, literally and figuratively, you were already ahead in the grand game of life. Step outside the front door of a Victorian home, and suddenly childhood became a survival sport. The streets weren't playgrounds. They were obstacle courses filled with danger, noise, and a steady drizzle of coal dust. Before you were even allowed out, your parents rattled off warnings like a general briefing his troops. Don't talk to strangers. Don't pick up anything shiny. And whatever you do, avoid puddles. That last rule sounded silly, until you stepped into one and discovered that Victorian puddles weren't surface-level splashes. They were bottomless portals of mud, horse droppings, and whatever the tanner's shop down the lane had dumped that morning. The moment you hit the street, chaos surrounded you. Horses clattered by pulling carriages, drivers shouting insults loud enough to peel paint. Milk carts and fishmongers barreled past, leaving trails of sour smells. Market vendors yelled prices that changed every time you blinked. Somewhere, always, a baby wailed, a dog barked, and a street musician screeched out a tune on a violin held together with string and optimism. And then there were the people, urchins darting between carriages, chimney sweeps younger than you covered head to toe in soot, eyes shining with the mischief of kids who climbed for a living. Your mother told you never to talk to them, but how could you resist trading a grin, a salute, or a marble? They knew the shortcuts, the alleyways, and the legends. If anyone could find a missing penny or a runaway cat, it was them. Crossing the street was an adventure of its own. Horses didn't stop, cabbies didn't care, and if you hesitated, you were splashed, shoved, or nearly trampled. By the time you got to the other side, your boots carried half the city on their soles and your heart pounded like you'd run a marathon. The air itself was a hazard. Fresh air in Victorian London meant a cocktail of coal smoke, manure, and mysterious vapors nobody could identify. Mothers wrapped scarves tight around children's mouths, swore by garlic necklaces, and muttered about miasmas. You coughed, sneezed, and kept walking, because that's what everyone did. But here's the strange thing. Beneath all the danger, there was a thrill. The streets were alive. Puppet shows popped up in alleys. Fairs rolled through with gingerbread, fireworks, and sticky toffee apples. Newsboys shouted headlines, acrobats performed for pennies, and on lucky days you caught sight of a parade marching past, banners flapping in the smoky wind. Of course, the adventure always ended the same way. Home again, pockets searched for contraband, boots scrubbed, and face washed so vigorously you feared your freckles might disappear. But as you lay in bed that night, the sounds of the city still echoed in your dreams. The clatter of who, the cry of vendors, the laughter of children dodging puddles and fate. The streets might have been dirty, dangerous, even deadly. But to a Victorian child, they were also alive, daring you to come back tomorrow and play the game again. School in Victorian times wasn't just about learning, it was about survival. Forget colorful classrooms, happy teachers, or field trips. Education was a gauntlet, designed less to inspire curiosity and more to drill obedience, polish manners, and squeeze every ounce of individuality out of a child. For boys, prep school was a battlefield. The day began with chapel, continued with endless drills in Latin and arithmetic, and ended with a cold march across a muddy field for cricket, rain, shine, or hail the size of walnuts. Teachers had little patience for mistakes. Write the wrong sum, expect your knuckles wrapped with a ruler. Lose focus. The dunce cap was waiting, and somewhere in the corner, always, was the cane, a constant reminder that learning came with consequences. The lessons themselves often bordered on the absurd. Boys were expected to memorize vast stretches of classical poetry they didn't understand, chant multiplication tables backward, and translate dead languages as though their futures depended on it. Science meant dissecting frogs you suspected were still twitching. Geography meant memorizing maps where half the world was stamped British interests. But if boys had it tough, girls lived an entirely different nightmare. Education for them wasn't about knowledge, it was about accomplishments. They were sent to finishing schools where the curriculum revolved around French conversation, needlework, watercolor painting, and playing the pianoforte with delicate hands. the unspoken rule. Learn just enough to impress at a parlor gathering, but not enough to challenge a man in debate. Arithmetic was kept to a minimum. Less numbers strained the female constitution. Literature was carefully filtered so as not to stir too much imagination. Girls practiced fainting gracefully, pouring tea without spilling, and walking into a room with the kind of glide that suggested good breeding. A crooked sash or a wobbly curtsy was considered an academic failure. And emotions, strictly forbidden. Boys were expected to suppress tears even if struck by a cricket ball. Girls could faint, yes, but tears were reserved for high drama and substandard lace. Laughter too loud, excitement too obvious, or ambition too visible, all were quickly corrected with a raised eyebrow, a lecture, or in extreme cases, an extra round of handwriting practice. Yet behind all that rigidity, small rebellions thrived. Boys passed contraband novels under their desks. Girls whispered stories of bold lady explorers when the governess wasn't looking. A sympathetic teacher or eccentric uncle might sneak a child a copy of Dickens, or even a kite, offering a glimpse of freedom in a world of stifling rules. At the end of the day, Victorian education succeeded in one thing. It trained children to master the art of endurance, to sit straight, to appear composed, to answer politely even when their heads were full of boredom or rebellion. It prepared them not for discovery or invention, but for surviving polite society. And yet, tucked away in diaries and whispered under blankets, those secret rebellions, those hidden sparks of curiosity hinted at something else. That even in an era obsessed with conformity, the human spirit still found ways to imagine, to dream, and to resist. Hey guys, let's step into one of the strangest corners of Victorian childhood, the nightmare of teething. Today, a baby fussing through teething might get a chilled teething ring, maybe some Tylenol drops if it's really bad. But in the 1800s, teething wasn't just a milestone. It was practically a crisis, and parents reached for remedies that would make modern doctors faint. The most innocent method was the bread crust. Yes, parents would hand a baby yesterday's stale loaf, basically a rock in carbohydrate form, and let them gnaw on it until their gums toughened up or their teeth chipped. If that didn't work, they moved on to brandy. A dab on the gums for medicinal purposes, they said, which explains why half the toddlers of the era were suspiciously good at holding their liquor. But the crown jewel of Victorian teething remedies was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. The label promised it would calm babies, ease colic, and guarantee a good night's sleep. And it delivered, because the bottle was laced with morphine and alcohol. Imagine dosing an infant with enough narcotics to drop a grown man, and you'll understand why so many Victorian nurseries were eerily quiet at night. Parents praised it, calling it a miracle in a bottle. Babies smiled at the wallpaper for days, and everyone pretended not to notice. And if soothing syrup wasn't available, there were always teething powders, cooling drafts, or even coral beads tied around the child's neck. Some families went with honey on the gums, which sounds sweet until you remember no one in Victorian England had ever heard the word botulism. Others recommended silver spoons, effective only if you happened to be born into money. Meanwhile, the family medicine chest looked less like a cabinet and more like an alchemist's lab. Bottles labeled in elegant cursive, powders in little tins, tonics glowing suspicious shades of green. And the contents, Mercury ointments, opium tinctures, chloroform drops. Every household had enough dangerous chemicals on hand to stock a crime novel. Of course, the baby wasn't the only one suffering. The entire household lived under siege during teething season. Nanny, siblings, even the family dog learned to tread carefully, waiting for the first wail that signaled another round of remedies. Older brothers and sisters were drafted to entertain the baby with puppet shows, silly dances, or anything distracting, none of which worked, because the only thing the baby wanted to chew on was their pinafore. When at last the teeth broke through, the family sighed in relief. Parents poured themselves sherry, Nanny finally unclenched her jaw, and the baby immediately tested their new teeth on everyone within reach. A rite of passage survived by grit, morphine, and a shocking disregard for dosage instructions. Looking back, it's a wonder anyone survived the nursery at all. Teething in the Victorian era wasn't just about new teeth, it was a crash course in resilience. If you could make it through your first year without numbing your tongue permanently, you were already ahead of the game. Hey guys, picture this. Your parents announce a family outing into the countryside. Sounds wholesome, right? Fields of wildflowers, fresh breezes, kids running free. Well, not in Victorian England. A nature walk wasn't about fun. It was a moving classroom where joy was carefully rationed and mud was treated like the plague. You were bundled in layers, petticoats, wool coats, gloves buttoned to your elbows, so tightly wrapped that the simple act of walking felt like training for a polar expedition. The family mantra was simple. There's no such thing as bad weather, only weak constitutions. So drizzle, hail, or full-on storm, off you marched. But don't think you could actually play outside. No chasing butterflies, no climbing trees, no rolling in the grass. Touching wildflowers was suspicious. Picking one. Grounds for a lecture on morality and probably the decline of Western civilization. If you dared to admire a daffodil too closely, Nanny would swoop in, gloves immaculate, and demand you recite its Latin name instead of, just enjoying it. Every outing came with rules. Birdsong could be admired but never imitated. Stones might be collected, but only if clean and later sterilized in boiling water. Even clouds had to be studied with reverence, shapes noted in proper prose. Shouting, laughing, or God forbid running down a hill, that was labeled vulgar. The irony was that adults obsessed over fresh air as a cure for every ailment, yet seemed horrified by children actually breathing too hard while playing. You could stand stiffly in the meadow, sketching an oak leaf, but not dare to climb the tree it fell from. Rabbits darting across a hedgerow, foxes slipping away in the distance. Those were treated as moral lessons rather than invitations to explore. And yet somehow, kids still found ways to rebel. A quick dash into a brook when the adults looked away, a handful of snails smuggled into a pocket, or a stolen game of who could jump the furthest behind a hedge. These were tiny acts of freedom, legendary among siblings, remembered in whispers long after the mud stains were scrubbed away. Still, despite the rules, there was magic. The scent of wet grass, the glimpse of a skylark, the thrill of sneaking a dandelion puff into your pocket. Even under a mountain of wool, children found wonder, because childhood has a way of slipping past the rules, even when the adults do everything in their power to stamp it out. In the end, the Victorian nature walk was less about fresh air and more about training kids to survive discomfort with a stiff upper lip. You didn't run wild. You walked politely, took notes, and prayed for rain so you could go back home. But for all the rules, Those stolen wild moments stayed with you forever. If you thought Victorian childhood was already a mix of discomfort and discipline, wait until the sun went down. Bedtime wasn't just about pajamas and prayers. It was an introduction to a world haunted by shadows, superstitions, and the kind of ghost stories that would give modern kids lifelong therapy bills. Victorian homes were drafty, creaky, and dimly lit. Every groan of the floorboards, every flicker of candlelight was treated as proof that the house had company of the otherworldly sort. Children were raised to believe spirits lurked in mirrors, in cold corners, even in the very air they breathed. Whistling indoors, dangerous. It might summon something from beyond. Stepping over a broom, a guarantee you'd never marry. Spill salt at dinner, you'd better fling a pinch over your left shoulder immediately, or the devil himself might be waiting behind you. Older siblings and uncles loved stoking the fear. They whispered tales of haunted nurseries, restless souls, and vengeful spirits who punished children for giggling after dark. Imagine lying in your iron bed, staring at arsenic green wallpaper peeling in the moonlight, convinced each shadow was a hand reaching for you. Thunder outside, that wasn't just weather, it was the wailing of the damned. And then there were the omens. A fork dropped at the dinner table meant a visitor was coming. A cradle rocked when no baby was inside. Tragedy was on the way. Dream about teeth falling out. Better not mention it before breakfast unless you wanted half the household in mourning. Superstition filled the air so thick that even coughing 3 times in a row got you handed a piece of bread, just in case. The thing is, fear wasn't just about spirits, it was about morality. Every misstep carried supernatural consequences. If you lied, stole jam, or forgot to curtsy, you didn't just risk punishment from your parents. You risked being haunted. Ghosts, you were told, preferred naughty children. Talk about pressure. But here's the twist. Those very superstitions created a strange kind of comfort. They gave structure to the unknown. They explained the unexplainable creaks and chills of old houses. Children grew up with rituals: cross yourself before bed, stir the pudding clockwise, never leave shoes upside down. That gave them a sense of control in a world full of chaos. So bedtime became a drama. Candlelight flickering, shadows crawling across the walls, whispers of spirits in every corner. You pulled the blankets tighter, whispered a prayer, and tried to convince yourself the scratching sound was just the family cat. In that moment, Victorian children learned one of life's first big lessons. Fear could be endured, ritual could be comforting, and sometimes surviving the night was an achievement in itself. Hey guys, if surviving haunted nurseries and arsenic wallpaper wasn't enough, let's talk about what happened when Victorian kids hit puberty. And let me tell you, this wasn't a milestone. It was a silent storm that nobody dared mention out loud. One morning, you're just a kid playing marbles. The next, your voice cracks in front of the entire dinner table, and everyone pretends not to notice. The very word puberty wasn't even spoken. Parents believed that if they ignored it, maybe it would pass like a seasonal cold. So instead of reassurance, you got cryptic warnings. Sit up straight, you're developing a stoop. Don't eat too much cheese, it stirs up ideas. Ideas about what? Nobody ever explained. The family library wasn't much help either. The medical encyclopedias offered vague illustrations and advice like, cultivate fortitude or take cold baths to control excess feelings, which is to say, good luck, kid. For boys, this meant sudden whiskers sprouting in odd places, voices sliding unpredictably from squeak to rumble, and the stern expectation to become manly overnight. Sports like cricket became compulsory, even if the only thing you felt like doing was hiding under the bed until your voice calmed down. Cousins whispered terrifying myths about what awaited, everything from wrestling rituals to mysterious emergencies requiring a handkerchief. Girls faced their own storm of silence. One day, a packet of mysterious blue ribbons appeared in your dresser, and that was your only warning. Mothers blushed, aunts muttered about womanly burdens, and any direct question was answered with more prayers. You were suddenly expected to glide into rooms, faint gracefully when overheated, and keep opinions bottled up tighter than your corset. And through it all, spots, emotions, awkward elbows, you were supposed to remain composed. Emotions, you see, were not Victorian approved. Crying, only if struck by a cricket ball. Anger, suppressed. Joy, dangerous. You were trained to sigh dramatically, write in your diary, or take a brisk walk until the storm passed. What did this create? A generation of young people who became masters at pretending. On the outside, calm and disciplined. On the inside, a whirlwind of crushes, confusion, and secret dreams. That first flutter of romance, it was written in a diary, whispered to a dog, or carefully hidden between the pages of Pilgrim's Progress. Courtship was conducted at arm's length by letter and always under watchful eyes. In the end, Victorian puberty was less about growing up and more about learning silence. You learned to hide your awkwardness, to act like nothing was happening while your whole body betrayed you. And when you finally graduated to the adult table, you understood why the grown-ups sat in such stiff silence. They were all survivors of the same unspoken storm. After a long day of porridge, punishments, and pretending not to notice that your voice just cracked at dinner, bedtime should have been a relief. But in a Victorian household, even going to sleep was another test of discipline. There were no cozy bedtime stories about friendly bears or magical lands. Instead, you were marched to your iron-framed bed, handed a nightshirt 2 sizes too big, and ordered to kneel on the cold floorboards for prayers. These weren't gentle prayers either. They were rapid-fire pleas, designed to be quick enough to avoid frostbite and serious enough to scare away any ghosts that might be listening from the wardrobe. After prayers came the bedtime story. But story was just another word for morality lecture. You'd get a whispered fable about the boy who ran indoors and was struck by lightning, or the girl who forgot her manners and was carried off by a stork. No pressure, right? Sleep tight, and don't you dare dream of misbehaving. If your parents were feeling especially modern, they might let you read in bed. But don't get too excited. The options were usually Pilgrim's Progress or a Bible verse collection. And even then, you were warned not to strain your eyes because too much reading by candlelight will leave you blind before 20. And then came the medicine chest, because if you had trouble sleeping, Victorian parents had a fix for that too. A spoonful of soothing syrup, a sedative draft, or a tonic that would knock out a grown man. Because yes, most of these were laced with opium, alcohol, or both. One sip and you'd either be out cold or floating through fever dreams of talking wallpaper. Families praised these potions as miraculous. The baby slept 8 hours straight, sure, but so did the dog who licked the spoon. The nursery itself didn't help. Fires had usually gone out, so the air was icy. Shadows danced on arsenic-dyed wallpaper, making everything feel just a little haunted. The house groaned, floorboards creaked, and somewhere a sibling stifled a giggle under scratchy wool blankets. If you were unlucky, the family dog snored by the fireless grate, adding to the chorus of unsettling noises. But even through all that, there were small comforts. Whispered conspiracies with a brother or sister before Nanny shushed you. The soft thump of a sibling's foot against the bedpost, letting you know you weren't alone. Secret promises of tomorrow's adventures, more marbles, more mischief, maybe an extra swipe of marmalade if you were lucky. Eventually, exhaustion won. You drift into uneasy dreams, haunted by tales of children carried away for misbehavior, soothed only by the faint rhythm of a sedative draft in your veins. Surviving bedtime in the Victorian era wasn't about rest. It was about making it through another night without nightmares, rashes, or moral failure. If you think modern potty training with sticker charts and positive reinforcement is tough, wait until you step into a Victorian nursery. For children back then, bathroom training wasn't about gentle encouragement. It was about discipline, shame, and porcelain contraptions that doubled as moral lessons. Every child had their own chamber pot, often tucked under the bed or hidden behind a folding screen. Some were painted with flowers or cherubs to encourage children. Others were bluntly decorated with stern mottos like cleanliness is next to godliness or look before you leap. Imagine learning bathroom habits with your conscience staring back at you every time you sat down. Accidents. Forget stickers or second chances. One slip and you got lectures about self-control, shame-filled glances from your parents, and sometimes even public humiliation. Older siblings delighted in retelling horror stories, true or invented, about cousins who missed the pot and had to apologize to the entire household, including the family cat. And then there was the dreaded night soil man. Once a week, he'd rattle down the alley with his cart, collecting the contents of every household's chamber pots and backyard privies. For Victorian kids, he wasn't just a worker. He was a living reminder of what awaited if you failed to keep things tidy. Your mistakes, quite literally, carted off for the neighborhood to see. But the real terror came when you graduated to the outdoor privy. Picture this: midnight freezing air, a lantern barely flickering, and your nanny insisting you learn resilience. The privy was a drafty wooden shack filled with spiders, dripping sounds, and a stench strong enough to strip paint. Every trip felt like a gothic adventure, part survival challenge, part ghost story. You clutched your shawl, prayed the lantern wouldn't go out, and wondered if this was how explorers felt crossing the Arctic. Victorian potty training wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about character. Children were told that self-control in the nursery would turn into discipline in adulthood. And so, from the age of 3, you were already balancing not just on a wobbly porcelain pot, but on the weight of family honor. Still, as bizarre and humiliating as it was, you survived. You learned balance, timing, and a healthy respect for porcelain. You also learned the golden rule of Victorian childhood. Whatever you do, do it quietly, do it properly, and never, ever bring it up at the breakfast table. Imagine waking up as a Victorian child. The first sound you hear isn't birdsong or a cozy good morning. It's the thunderous swoosh of Nanny throwing open the curtains and announcing that idleness leads to ruin. Before you can rub the sleep out of your eyes, you're already drafted into the daily war with Victorian clothing. Getting dressed wasn't a routine. It was a full-contact sport. Boys, girls, rich, poor, it didn't matter. Everyone had to wrangle with buttons, buckles, ties, and shoelaces in quantities that made a modern tax form look simple. 5-year-olds were expected to wrestle into layers most adults today would refuse to wear. For girls, the first hurdle was the corset. Yes, even children wore them. Officially, they were for posture training, but in reality they felt more like rib crushers. Nanny laced you up with the precision of a ship's captain tightening sails. One tug, 2 pulls, and suddenly you were straighter, thinner, and completely unable to take a deep breath. If you dared to complain, the reply was always the same. Queen Victoria wore tighter stays, and look how well she turned out. Boys didn't have it easier. Their nemesis was the starched collar, so stiff it could practically stand up on its own. It was strapped around your neck every morning like a portable guillotine. Mothers treated collars as proof of discipline droop, and you risked moral collapse. Some collars were so sharp they could double as emergency splints if someone fainted from heat. Layering was sacred law. No matter the weather, scorching summer or icy winter, you were expected to wear 3 to 5 layers of fabric. Wool, flannel, cotton, maybe even velvet if you were unlucky. The belief was simple. Children were fragile, and fragility could only be cured by suffocating them under fabric. Of course, this meant by midday you were sweating buckets, praying for a fainting couch, or secretly hoping for a breeze strong enough to knock you out. Special occasions made things worse. Picture lace collars with microscopic hooks, sailor suits that required advanced knot tying, and hats pinned so tightly into your scalp you wondered if your skull was part of the outfit. Shoes were stiff, narrow, and impossible to remove without adult assistance. And family portraits, forget smiles. Those grim, haunted expressions you see in old photos weren't about Victorian seriousness. They were the faces of children sitting in itchy lace for 3 hours, trying not to pass out. Yet strangely enough, this daily struggle taught skills. You learned patience, agility, and a quiet appreciation for stolen barefoot moments. A sagging sock or a popped button wasn't just a wardrobe malfunction. It was a public morality tale. Mothers would swoop in with a needle and thread, turning every tear into a lesson about vigilance and virtue. By nightfall, peeling off your layers felt like winning a small war. You'd collapse into bed, your skin still marked with corset lines and collar imprints, dreaming of freedom. And maybe, just maybe, whispering a rebellious prayer for a day without buckles, laces, and wool. If you think your family's medicine drawer today is cluttered with expired aspirin and cough drops, wait until you step inside a Victorian home. Their version of a first aid kit looked more like a chemistry set designed by a sleep-deprived magician. Every respectable family had a cabinet full of mysterious bottles, powders, and syrups. The labels were elegant, written in swirling copperplate script, but the ingredients, a modern pharmacist would have called the police. Alcohol, opium, chloroform, mercury, laudanum. This wasn't just medicine, it was a cocktail of nightmares. Got a cough. Out came a thick, brown syrup that smelled like a brewery and tasted even worse. Parents would smile reassuringly and say it contained goodness. You quickly learned that goodness was code for whatever was left in the apothecary's back room, mixed with enough opium to knock out a horse. 2 spoonfuls, and you were either sleeping, hallucinating, or composing love poems to the wallpaper. For cuts and scrapes, there was mercury ointment, slathered on with the belief that if it stung, it must be working. Bigger wounds earned you a splash of carbolic acid, followed by something called healing paste, which usually amounted to pig fat mixed with wishful thinking. Bruises, rub them with goose fat or, if you were lucky, butter. because apparently the Victorian solution to pain was making children more edible. And then came the infamous remedies for nerves. Children were not supposed to have nerves, but if you cried too much or jumped at thunder, you were dosed with Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. The active ingredient, morphine. Parents praised it as a miracle. In reality, it was a miracle if you survived childhood without becoming addicted before kindergarten. Colds and fevers brought mustard plasters, pasted on your chest with the solemnity of a knight being anointed. They burned like fire, left rashes, and somehow convinced everyone you were on the mend. If that didn't work, garlic necklaces were tied around your neck. The theory was that they drew out the illness. The reality was that you smelled like soup for a week. And when all else failed, the doctor was called. His black bag carried forceps, a stethoscope, and an alarming number of leeches. The Victorian belief was simple: if you weren't bleeding, you weren't healing. Stomach issues got their own horror show. Constipation, castor oil, a punishment so legendary you prayed for death instead. Diarrhea, a bland rice gruel and a lecture about your unruly intestines. And if you ever admitted to melancholy, you'd be handed a cordial so strong it stripped paint and maybe a few layers off your tongue. It wasn't just about cures. Illness was a family event. Relatives gathered around your sick, each offering unsolicited advice and their own favorite remedy. Aunt Agnes swore by turpentine drops. Cousin Alfred told everyone he once cured a limp with vinegar and prayer. Meanwhile, you lay there hoping for something as simple as hot milk and silence. In the end, surviving Victorian medicine wasn't about healing. It was about luck, stubbornness, and an iron stomach. If you pulled through, you didn't just recover. You became immune to half the known toxins of the century. If you grew up with siblings, you probably remember the tug-of-war over toys, the whispered conspiracies, and the occasional "it wasn't me, it was him." Now imagine all that, but in a Victorian nursery, where alliances shifted faster than the London fog. The nursery wasn't just a playroom, it was a battlefield. Possessions were never safe. That top you treasured, gone the moment you blinked. Your marble collection, swiped, rolled under the wardrobe, and now claimed by your brother who insists it was always his. Even your secret stash of peppermint drops mysteriously vanished, leaving only sticky fingerprints as evidence. Alliances were fragile. You and your sister might spend days plotting a daring midnight escape into the kitchen for a forbidden slice of cake. But when the moment came, your little brother's inability to whisper quietly doomed the mission. Now, he'd shout just as Nanny appeared in the doorway, armed with suspicion and cod liver oil. Betrayal was the nursery's favorite currency. Maybe you confided in your sister about the hiding spot for your sweets, only to discover it raided, with a smug note reading, "Better luck next time." Or your brother swore loyalty during the Great Curtain Fort War, only to defect the moment you were called away for handwriting drills. Closet space was another war front. That one shelf in the wardrobe, it was more valuable than gold. Kings rose and fell in single afternoons. Today you reigned supreme over the coveted top shelf. Tomorrow you were exiled to the damp corner where your shoes mysteriously smelled of cabbage. And yet, there were moments of unity. When the sound of Nanny's footsteps echoed down the hall, hostilities ceased instantly. Suddenly you were all angels, silently embroidering or pretending to practice Latin declensions. A common enemy brought peace, at least until she left the room again. Sometimes rebellion meant daring escapes. A quick dash to the garden to dig for treasure, which usually turned out to be last season's carrots. or sneaking into the pantry for cheese rinds and stale bread, luxuries worth the risk of punishment. Every successful mission became a story told at bedtime, whispered under scratchy blankets like epic sagas of survival. But the strongest memories weren't just of rivalry. They were of survival together. The whispered bedtime jokes, the stifled laughter at Cousin Bertie's lopsided haircut, or the secret pact to protect the youngest sibling from taking the blame, unless, of course, they deserved it. By the time you finally drifted off to sleep, the nursery was alive with quiet snores, muffled giggles, and the unspoken truth. You loved each other fiercely, even if you would never admit it while awake. Victorian siblinghood wasn't just rivalry, it was training for life. You learned strategy, negotiation, betrayal, and forgiveness, all before the age of 10. If you thought modern parents were full of questionable advice, Victorian parents had them beat by a mile. Their wisdom came wrapped in superstition, moral panic, and a dash of comedy, though none of it was funny if you were the kid listening. Victorian children grew up with a steady drizzle of warnings. Don't sit near a draft or you'll catch your death. Don't swallow a cherry pit or a tree will grow inside you. Don't laugh too loudly or the neighbors will think you've lost your mind. Every ordinary act carried some invisible threat. Even standing by the window became suspicious. Cousin Percival once did that and never walked the same again. Whatever that meant, instead of explaining the real dangers like, say, arsenic wallpaper or mercury medicine, parents leaned on folklore. Cross your eyes and they'll stay that way forever. Rock an empty cradle and tragedy will come. And if you dream of teeth falling out, well, better start planning a funeral. Comforting, right? Food came with its own library of warnings. Don't eat too many sweets or you'll ruin your character. Don't read novels while eating, it will corrupt your digestion. And heaven forbid you show enthusiasm for French toast. Anything vaguely enjoyable was immediately suspect, a temptation designed to weaken both your body and your moral fiber. Even reading wasn't safe. Don't read by candlelight or you'll go blind. Don't read novels, or your imagination will make you unfit for marriage. Don't read standing up, sitting down, or lying down. In fact, just don't read at all, unless it's the Bible or moral poetry, and even then, don't enjoy it too much. The advice often bordered on the poetic or absurd. Keep your shoes clean and your conscience cleaner. Trust the postman, but never the post. Never speak to anyone with a mustache after sundown. These weren't jokes. They were considered sound parenting tips. So, what did kids learn from this non-stop flood of parental warnings? Mainly how to nod politely and say, "Yes, Father," while secretly planning the next mischief. Victorians meant well, but their wisdom was often a mix of half-remembered superstitions and desperate attempts to control a world they didn't fully understand. In the end, Victorian parental advice wasn't about keeping you safe. It was about keeping you anxious, cautious, and maybe just a little bit paranoid. Qualities they believed built character. Whether or not it did is up for debate, but one thing's certain, it made for some truly bizarre childhood memories. Let's step into the Victorian nursery again, but this time really look at what's around you. At first glance, it seems cozy. Pastel walls, heavy curtains, soft rugs, colorful toys, but look closer. That soothing green wallpaper, it's laced with arsenic. Those plush carpets, dyed with mercury. Even the curtains, swaying gently in the breeze, are woven with chemical colors so toxic they could burn your skin. Victorian design was all about elegance, lush, layered, and rich with detail. Unfortunately, it was also a death trap. Lead paint chipped from the walls into the mouths of curious toddlers. Tin soldiers and painted alphabet blocks carried more poison than play value. Even the humble teething ring might be carved from ivory and coated with whatever leftover paint was handy. Imagine gnawing on that as a baby. At night, the danger didn't stop. You were tucked into a mountain of bedding stuffed with horsehair, feathers, and secret fillers no one questioned too closely. The mattress carried the dust of generations, and asbestos was tucked into the cracks as insulation. If you were lucky, the lavender sachet stuffed in the pillows covered up the smell of slow chemical decay. Ventilation, forget it. Windows stuck in summer, screamed open in winter, and when your parents compromised, they stuffed the gaps with more asbestos. Breathing was an act of bravery. Every sigh brought in fumes from gas lamps, soot from coal fires, and the faint tang of chemical dyes off-gassing into the room. And yet nobody thought twice. Parents believed these designs made homes modern, stylish, and protective. As long as you weren't catching a chill, they figured everything was fine. Meanwhile, you were living in a pastel coffin lined with poisons, and the family cat, smarter than most, refused to step inside. What's wild is how normalized it all was. Stories circulated of children licking the wallpaper, of pets gnawing on curtain tassels, of kids carrying their tin soldiers everywhere and wondering why their teeth ached. Instead of recognizing the toxins, families chalked it up to weak constitutions or moral decline. Somehow, children survived. Maybe not all, but enough to keep the cycle going. And if you grew up surrounded by arsenic paint and asbestos dust, you probably carried a strange badge of honor. The knowledge that you were tough enough to outlive your own bedroom. Hey guys, we've walked together through the strange, strict, and often dangerous world of Victorian parenting. From arsenic wallpaper to morphine-laced baby syrup, from icy weekly baths to wire cages hanging babies over the street, it's hard to believe these practices were once considered normal. By today's standards, much of it would be illegal, downright criminal even. But back then, it was called building character. And yet, here's the fascinating part. Children survived. They grew into adults who carried the scars, the resilience, and the strange humor of their time. Maybe that's the bigger lesson history hands us. Not just the absurdity of what came before, but the human stubbornness to keep going, to raise kids the best they could with the knowledge they had, even if that knowledge came wrapped in superstition, soot, and a side of goose fat. When you think about it, that's why these stories still matter. They remind us how far we've come. Today, no one's hanging their baby in a wire box for fresh air, or dosing toddlers with opium syrup so they'll sleep. We know better, we live safer, and childhood, for all its modern challenges, is filled with comforts Victorian kids couldn't have dreamed of. So as you tuck yourself into bed tonight, be glad for clean sheets, safe walls, and medicine that actually helps instead of haunts. Let the strangeness of Victorian childhood fade into the past, a story to marvel at, to laugh at, and to learn from. And with that, I'll leave you to rest. Close your eyes, let go of the noise of the day, and drift into dreams knowing you're safe, warm, and free from nanas with mustaches and arsenic curtains. Good night, everyone. Sleep well.